Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Tuesday edition of Point of View, and we are going to be talking about energy and the environment, maybe get into the Green New Deal and a number of other things. And when we scheduled this, we didn't know how appropriate it would be because as those of you that are in the Northeast right now, that nor'easter came through and had almost record-setting snow dumped on Boston. Million people without power right now. This time a year ago, we had what's called Snowmageddon down here in Texas, and a lot of people did not have power as well. We're in a building which a couple hours ago didn't have water, but it does have power. So I think we're doing fine here. But it's a good illustration of the fact that sometimes we don't think about energy until we lose energy. Yet both of my guests here have been spending quite a bit of time thinking about this. Dr. Merrill Matthews, certainly an individual that's been with us many times before, resident scholar at the Institute for Policy Innovation. And we've posted just 2 of his many articles on energy. And so always great to have you in studio.
Good to be back again, Kerby.
And we have Jacki Deason back once again. She is the host of the Jacki Daily Show on Blaze Media. Individual, we've posted one of her articles that appeared on the Texas Public Policy Foundation, also former counsel to the chairman of the subcommittee on the Constitution in the U.S. House of Judiciary Committee. So it's great to have you here as well.
Great to be back.
Let's, if we can, talk about what's going on right now. When you lose power, Dr. Matthews, sometimes it's just simply because ice on the wires and they break. But this time last year, there were a lot of other problems. We had wind turbines freezing up. We had natural gas not flowing. We had actual coal turning into bricks of solid ice. And
yes,
that was not good. So
yes, and the generators weren't really conditioned for that cold weather. I mean, the problem we have here is being able to run the power generators in real high heat, not real cold weather. So you can do those things, but it's things that they tend to do in the north more than we do here. And so when we get hit by it wasn't a record cold because you can go back about 120 years and we hit colder weather, but it's awfully expensive to sort of be prepared for the coldest possible winter. And we got caught unawares on that, and they've tried to make some changes, and we've got some cold weather coming now, and we'll see if it works.
Yeah, a couple of days from now, we might be playing a tape. I hope not. But Jacki, you've been through this as well, and I remember you talking about the fact that we just weren't planning in Texas for cold weather, and yet sometimes cold weather is just as bad here as it is in other parts of the country.
No, that's right. And as Buddy was saying, I mean, we knew that a grid problem was on its way because of the way that the Texas capacity is now structured in the market. This didn't surprise some of us who work on these issues. We knew outages were coming. We were only surprised that it happened in the wintertime and not the summertime. Mm-hmm. That's when you expect peak demand for Texans, and especially because every year we have 500,000 new Texans moving here from other states. Plus, we have all the people up to 2 million coming across the southern border who have to come here and use power too. That's a huge growing demand on the Texas grid all the time. And we're not building out reliable energy capacity generation for the grid. I mean, we need coal, natural gas, or nuclear to be ready to go, dispatchable on a moment's notice, reliable. But instead, we're building out wind and solar, which work intermittently. They work when they feel like it. Unfortunately, the most extreme weather is when they don't work at peak. That's when they are at their worst. So, during the storm, natural gas actually ramped way up and performed heroically. Nuclear plugged right along, and we had wind collapse down to at 1.5% of its ability to generate.
Wow.
It was, I mean, renewables are a no-show, right? How can the solar panel generate, have electrons at work when there is no sun getting through inches of ice and snow on that panel? This is really very simple in some ways. So that's what happened. And if you keep expanding the unreliable energy and, decommissioning the reliable energy with a growing population, this is what happens. And it's not going to happen just once. This will happen again.
Let's, if we can, maybe go to another part of the country, and that's California. One of the articles we've posted here is by you, Dr. Merrill Matthews, that really the California blackouts are a preview of the Green New Deal. And our listeners in California might say, oh, we're not worried about winter. We are worried about the summer, aren't they?
They are, and several things that they've done. They've spent money trying to expand their renewable energy and didn't use that money to ensure that power lines and other things were secure and safe. Winds blow in California sometimes very hard, and that causes some of the fires that are there. And then some of the fires the wildfires that have erupted there, when people have to get out, if you didn't charge up your car in time, and now they're coming to your door saying you need to get out right now, but you haven't charged up your car, you have no way to go anywhere. So it's really a problem.
Wow.
Gavin Newsom has mentioned some of these problems, has taken a little bit of the blame, but not nearly enough. But I don't see them doing anything, Jackie, to really fix the issues.
Well, and too little is being done in Texas, too. I mean, listen, California is our favorite whipping boy in the state, and we all know that. It is fun to contrast us to them, but in fact, we have a similar problem here, and neither state is really getting it done in terms of securing human life. I think it's important that we always talk about this issue in terms of human life, because people don't realize Texans lost their lives in that storm last year, and the official count is about 150 to 200, but I've seen estimates of up to 700 to 1,000 people who died. If you look at excess deaths, right? So people who, for example, maybe they didn't freeze to death like some people actually did, or die of carbon monoxide poisoning in their garage running their car trying to stay alive. But if you have a heart problem, for example, and you are at a suboptimal temperature, you cannot afford to keep your house heated above 55 degrees, or maybe you're forced, as last year, you could not. That can bring on death for people who are already predisposed and vulnerable. And we saw those excess deaths during that storm in Texas. So the coroner is not going to call that death from from a power outage. They're going to call it a cardiac issue, when in fact what it was a direct result of the policy collapse, is what it was. Failure to plan.
Well, again, I saw that in my own neighborhood. My wife and I walk twice a day. She walks me just like a dog twice a day. And we met this one neighbor who said this other individual, because it was cold, she had slipped and fell, but then she couldn't get out and she had a heart attack. Well, again, that wasn't listed as a COVID death or even as a, if you will, snowmageddon death. But in some respects, all those things came together, and that was one of those excess deaths. So let's take a break. When we come back, I want to maybe get into that a little bit more, because if indeed we want to actually give people an opportunity to thrive, then we need reliable energy. So I want to go around the round table and get some of your thoughts about, as we've mentioned before, the whole idea of the focus on renewable energy, how that works, and whether or not by focusing so much time and attention on it, we've taken our eyes off the ball. I'd like to get your thoughts about that. And then also just some of the other environmental issues. And Jackie, you have a piece here as well about affordable energy is really a great way to combat inequality. We don't necessarily think about how energy and the economy and the standard of life are all together. So we're going to talk about that. And most importantly, I wanted to give some of you a chance, if you've got some questions about the electrical grid, about energy, about the Green New Deal, all sorts of other topics. We're going to open up the phones relatively early to give you a chance to ask a question, because we have two experts here today. And that phone number is 800-351-1212. Posted a couple of articles from the Institute for Policy Innovation, as well as Jackie's piece from the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And then you can follow those to find other really good articles. And we'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Back
Back in October and November, I did commentaries about the letter that was sent to the White House from the National School Board Association suggesting that protesting parents could be designated as domestic terrorists. It encouraged the administration to use any laws at its disposal, including the Patriot Act originally intended for Muslim terrorists. The school board letter led to Attorney General Merrick Garland's memorandum directing the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office to investigate parents protesting school boards. They were to investigate what was called a disturbing spike in harassment, intimidation, and threats of violence against school administrators, board members, teachers, and staff. At the time, I argued that any true acts of intimidation and violence deserved action from local law enforcement. But most of the examples cited did not involve violence and could hardly justify federal involvement. The National School Board Association apologized for sending the letter and admitted they should have had a better process in place to allow for consultation in communication of this significance. But it turns out that they did consult with President Biden's Education Secretary as internal emails obtained from a Freedom of Information Act request. Although the Education Department spokesman claims that the Secretary didn't solicit a letter from the school board, I think we understand the process. One branch of the federal government consults with a private organization that then sends a letter to the federal government. Then the Attorney General writes a memorandum calling for action against parents. See how it works? By the way, the administration didn't apologize. Instead, the Justice Department then announced that it was forming a new domestic terrorism unit. No wonder so many Americans are becoming so disillusioned with this administration. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, talking about energy and the environment. If you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Merrill Matthews and Jacki Deason with us. And Jacki, let me come to you for just a few minutes talking about these alternative sources of power. I'm all in on any source of power. I don't care whether it's fossil fuels or nuclear or solar or wind. But when you focus so much time on alternative and intermittent sources of power, that is not helpful for the grid when you actually have peak loads, right?
Right. I mean, this is a life or death issue. And so I always say that because, I'm lucky. We had a generator. We didn't suffer at all. I won't lie to you in that storm because I actually happen to work in this area. So we were prepared. A few people actually go to that kind of length. But for most people, they were completely dependent and reliant upon the experts and the regulators and people who should know what they're doing to make sure they have the energy they need to stay alive. And a lot of Texans were failed. And so that's completely avoidable. This is completely self-inflicted. We don't have to have this problem. But for as long as we insist on electrifying everything, that means coming off of natural gas, for example, as a source of heat and moving on to electric, you're only making the problem worse and worse and worse, especially moving from traditional vehicles to electric vehicles. Now you're going to actually, again, ramp up the demand ridiculously rather than diversifying where our energy is coming from. And so I think these are huge mistakes. And, look, we were 4 minutes away from grid collapse in Texas.
I can't believe this.
Last time, 4 minutes away with a booming population ever growing. Again, I really cannot impose the urgency of the situation. If that grid had collapsed, I am told it would take a couple of months to get it back. That means in 4 days, people wouldn't have water and would be going into societal collapse. There'd be no food. It would be. I might almost lose credibility to go into painting the picture of what it would look like when people don't have food and water, and you've got millions of Texans to provide for. We can't let that happen, and so we need to stop artificially building out unreliable energy, which is wind and solar, and instead push out more natural gas, coal, or nuclear to make sure this doesn't happen, because it doesn't have to.
Dr. Merrill Matthews, I remember you doing an article one time where you were saying, this idea that we can solve the problem by having lots more windmills and a lot more solar. And you were doing a calculation on how much of like the Midwest we'd have to have solar panels to even begin to offset.
If I remember correctly, we had something like 60,000 windmills, wind turbines out there now, and that we were going to have to multiply them by a factor of 10 or so just to take up what the fossil fuels were doing right then. That wasn't counting the nuclear and so forth, just the fossil fuels. And it was going to be like 660,000 wind turbines around the country. It was going to be a lot. But and to Jacki's point, so much of the push for renewable energy is just simply ideologically driven. It's not practically driven. And I remember, I think it was Boston, I'm thinking probably 5 or 6 years ago. If I remember right, Boston was thinking about moving all of their city vehicles to be electric, and instead of fossil fuel driven vehicles. And they got a huge snow dump, sort of like they had here just the other day. And the machines were going 24 hours a day, the snow plows and so forth, trying to get the snow out of the streets and so forth. You can't run electric vehicles, 24 hours a day. You got to charge them up.
And there you go. And so you're out of luck on that. Well, one other one while we're talking about vehicles for just a second, and that is, I think you also pointed out that even though we were trying to provide all these tax credits for electric vehicles, we only have 1 or 2 that are actually working right now, right?
Right. Yeah, it's interesting that we keep trying to do that. The one company that really does well is, of course, Tesla. And people want to go out and buy that, but they want to keep providing these electric, various types of tax credits. And the companies, the major car companies, are trying to transition that way because they see that's where the government money is.
Right.
And so GM has come up and said they want to have, I believe it's 40% of their fleet to be electric vehicles by 2025. And that was last year. It's going to be essentially 4 years. It said the end of 2025. And I'm looking at this and saying, you've had one all-electric vehicle. That was the Bolt. Nobody bought it. It had trouble. They had to have a recall and recall every one of them because they were catching on fire. So the company sent out a notice along with the EPA saying, if you have one, don't park it near a building.
Or in a garage.
Or
you will.
Because it might catch on fire.
Yeah.
Now, I suspect they'll be doing much better at these at some point. But the only reason you would be doing that is because you're trying to get government subsidies to cover that.
That is amazing. We're talking about this whole idea of alternative energy, and on the break we were just talking about the fact that when you talk about these wind turbines, not only are they not producing power all the time because the wind blows and sometimes it doesn't blow, but it has killed off an enormous number of raptors and bats. And I think most people that if you have any kind of concern about animals have to say these aren't exactly good. And when Dr. Merrill Matthews is talking about 660,000 of these, this is like just completely wiping out anything that happens to be flying around.
Well, my husband is a big donor to the Peregrine Fund, so I have to learn this subject forward, backward, inside out because he loves raptors. The American kestrel population went down 75% over the past few decades. 75%. And then, so you start looking into reasons why, and there are theories, right? We took a look at wind turbines and some experts who had been involved in that business. And they said essentially this: number one, there are gag orders that people sign when they go to work for these wind companies to not talk about all of the fatalities of the birds.
I did not know that. Yeah.
Second, the methodology behind some of these studies showing the fatalities are like this. They will check for carcasses at the bottom of the turbines once every 30 days or once every 90 days. I ran an experiment in my backyard. Okay, husband shot a squirrel. I threw it in the center of the backyard to see how long does it take for an animal to run off with that carcass. The answer was 6 hours. In 6 hours, a red-tailed hawk was there eating the squirrel. And I took a video of this saying, look, 6 hours. sometimes they check every 90 days at the bottom of the turbines. Well, those carcasses are being carried off. The other thing is they only check within a 40-yard radius. They need to be looking at like 200-yard radius. And the other thing, and I saw this recently, they've started using dogs to sniff out the carcasses because sometimes there's like brush, right, grown up beneath the wind turbines. The dogs detect 95% more carcasses than humans with the naked eye looking for carcasses. They find legs and wings and things like this. So here's my point. Whatever numbers you think you have on the number of raptors killed by wind turbines, it's probably exponentially larger. And I've seen estimates as high as 1 billion birds and bats in North America killed by wind turbines. And this, again, completely unnecessary. This doesn't have to happen. And by the way, I've said, I'm not talking about taking the turbines down. Even I'm like, why not have some kind of sonar on the turbine to fend off the birds with some kind of sound or something else? Or now they're saying you can paint the turbines different colors so the birds can see them better. I'm not sure of the efficacy of all of that, but something needs to be done because it's not acceptable. And now we're going to, explode the build out of this technology? Do we want any raptors at all? I mean, they're important to the ecosystem. This is actually very important. And strangely, notice the silence of the environmentalists on this issue. I shouldn't have to be the person making this argument, but it's me. You know, they're relying on Jacki from the Jacki Daily Show to be the advocate for raptors, and there should be a whole movement out there.
And it was environmentalist Barack Obama who gave I think in Wisconsin, a dispensation for being able to kill more raptors from the wind turbines because they were killing more than the allowed amount.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, and you have to think about the bats, too. When I was in graduate school, one of the professors we had, he was working with bats, and it's amazing because bats have echolocation. But I think a bat's flying around and then something flies in front of them, they don't think that it's going to be something they'll hit, and then the next one flies around and knocks them out. So even though they have echolocation, they get eliminated by these wind turbines as well if the wind's blowing that night. So anyway, we need to take a break, and when we come back, I want to get your thoughts about some of these other issues. I know Dr. Merrill Matthews has had Michael Schellenberger on at IPI talking about this whole issue of apocalypse never, and we've had some others addressing some of these issues. And what about this whole idea of the Green New Deal? Even though it hasn't passed, I think both of you would agree that the so-called infrastructure bill certainly pushed ahead this idea of the Green New Deal. And sometimes you'd be surprised what's in the Green New Deal package. So Dr. Matthews will educate us on that, and I know Jacki will as well. So let me take a break. If you find yourself saying, this is material I'd really like to read, I didn't know some of these things, those facts and figures and information are available on our website at pointofview.net. Got a couple of different articles that you can read, and those will link you to others. Let me just mention we do have a booklet I produced a while back on energy and the environment, and of course one on climate change. Just so if you said, I'd like to know some more about this, I want to ask my member of Congress about this, I want to see what we can do to maybe educate people, that's what we're trying to do today here on Point of View as we talk about energy and the environment. But let's also open up the phones. Maybe you have some comments or questions. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join the conversation, energy and the environment, we're going to get into also the Green New Deal and climate change and some other aspects of that as well. Jacki Deason and Dr. Merrill Matthews with us. And let's head to Georgia first. Todd, I think you have a question or comment that you would like to add to the discussion, so thank you for calling.
Thank you, Kerby. Just wondering if anyone was aware that Georgia Power, that is owned by Southern Company, made an announcement yesterday. They will be shutting down all coal-fired units except for two. I believe it's 2028, which is not far off. And the other two units would be dismantled by 2035. I just don't understand how they can take away our renewable energy like that. Excuse me, I don't mean renewable energy. But anyway, they're going to do away with all the coal-fired power plants. And they're putting in solar like crazy, and it looks to me like quadruple the amount of land to do a solar project that doesn't put out half the power.
Good point. And again, when you talk about fossil fuel, that is concentrated energy. And whether you're talking about coal or oil or natural gas, but you're talking about a diffused energy with solar or wind or some of the others. Now, nuclear is also concentrated. But what about this? I remember a time, Jacki, not so long ago, where we had a presidential candidate saying, basically, we'll just close down coal all over the country. And I think Senator Joe Manchin wasn't really excited about that.
No, and then that candidate went to West Virginia and begged for their vote, which was really fun to watch and ridiculous, and they didn't buy it. Well, I think that Southern Company needs to pay attention to the example of Europe, because right now Europe is reversing its policy and going back to coal. And in fact, because they don't use their own, they've kind of taken the money out of their own operations. They're importing U.S. coal.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah.
And you're going to watch the same thing happen all over the world, because they're going to find out that the math does not work. You can use some renewables, some. But right now in the U.S., we're only using them to the tune of single digits for what we need. People like to say things like, well, in Texas, it's a third, or like in Germany, they're 50% renewable. What that actually meant, in the German story in particular, one day, one moment in Germany at the lowest demand moment probably in the year, they actually were able to run on 50% renewable. But the headline says Germany, 50% renewable energy. So there's a lot of funny business in how it's explained. Watch for the words generation versus capacity. It's one thing to say you've got a third wind capacity. That doesn't mean that you get a third of your energy from wind that actually generated. I mean, it generates in a variable rate, which is part of what happened with the Texas storm. And Georgia should pay attention, and every state should. This is going everywhere, because they run an average of what you get from each source and plan ahead based on the demand they expect for that month. Well, for wind, for us in February, I think it was around 7%, which is much diminished from other parts of the year. What happened when it collapsed down to 1.5%? See, that wasn't in the planning. Mm-hmm. So where are you going to find the energy to make up what was not there? And that's what Southern Company in Georgia and everywhere needs to pay attention to.
And of course, one of the reasons why some of the states have been transitioning their power generation from coal, they're going to natural gas as opposed to renewable energy. And that's natural gas because the fracking boom has made natural gas present year or two accepted very, very affordable and very cheap. So that's one of the best sources for doing it.
What about coal when we look at it nationwide and then worldwide? Because there are certain places in this country where more power companies use more coal than others. But let's now move over to China and India and places like that. Even if we were to substantially reduce the amount of dependency the United States has on fossil fuel, gets back to the whole issue of climate change. They're building coal-fired plants every day, aren't they?
Yeah, and they're not going to stop for a while. I think it's going to be mid-2030s, I think they said, before they'll actually change that. And there was this clean coal technology. I'm not sure that is, I don't know if that's as good as they've claimed it would be. Do you know, Jacki?
Well, the American clean coal is quite good. So there are many different ways, and I mean, from carbon capture to actually just removing impurities or trying to stop it at the plant and capture it at the plant, the actual particulate matter, which is the dangerous kind of air pollution. The U.S. is quite good at this. And as my friend Jason Isaac jokes at Texas Public Policy Foundation, if only the Chinese would steal that technology instead of everything else, because that would be a real improvement in the world. But in fact, China, no one polices China. We don't tell China what to do, and we're not going to. And so they will do whatever they need to do to feed 1.3 billion people and grow that economy. And coal is key to that.
It seems to me that as a country actually develops more significantly, two things happen. First of all, the standard of living goes up, and that relates, of course, to your column that we've posted there. But something else, as you have more sophistication, you actually are able to develop ability to produce energy with less pollution because you have scrubbers and you have all sorts of technologies that then make it efficient. So the assumption always is as energy usage goes up, pollution goes up, but actually it tends to curve down. Is that fair?
Well, the U.S. is the number one country for reducing carbon emissions, which proves that we have the biggest economy. We've grown monstrously over the past 25 years in population and GDP, and yet the emissions have gone down if emissions are your thing. But also if real pollution is your thing, such as the particulate matter, lead in the air, ozone, the 6 federally regulated pollutants, we are down 70% since 1970 in this country. And that's because we are great innovators. Now, it costs money, right? To actually add these technologies costs money. And we as a people value clean air, so we tolerate or even encourage this policy. The Chinese probably will not go to this expense, right, to clean, or maybe they will. I mean, I don't know what they're going to plan, but the point is that we both innovate, which puts us first and makes us cleanest, even though we have the biggest economy. But it also is a value that we have. All of us like clean air. All of us like clean water. So we don't mind paying a little extra for the catalytic converter or whatever.
But again, we're going to be having the Olympics at the end of the week here. And of course, the last time we had the Beijing Olympics weren't in the winter, it was in the summer. You just have a lot of pollution.
They did, yes. And of course, India has been expanding in coal as well. And of course, you've got a developing economy there with a lot of people. They want energy because they want to be able to grow as an economy. And they're not going to be able to do it by using expensive renewables. It's just not functionally viable.
We've been talking about the Green New Deal, and just before I take a break, Dr. Matthews, of course, one aspect of the Green New Deal is no matter what we do in the United States, you can see what India and China are doing without us. But there was another aspect. You've written about this before. If you were to actually look at the Green New Deal legislation, you'd say most of it doesn't seem to have to do at all with energy.
They're trying to do racial justice in there. They're trying to go through and refit buildings and do a whole range of things that really don't have anything to do with sort of improving the economy.
So again, I want to come back maybe after the break and talk about what affordable energy means, for various companies and things of that nature, what it means for other countries, I should say. But also, Dr. Merrill Matthews, just before we take a break, one of our pieces is the energy axis of evil.
Yes.
We did mention that on Friday, but I thought it would be good because it's our second article. Explain that if you might.
This has to do with Russia, China, and Iran. Of course, George W. Bush came up with the axis of evil, and this is the energy axis of evil, where these countries are using energy to fund mischievous and nefarious things politically. And Russia specifically uses its access to energy as a political hammer to make sure that other countries, European Union especially, don't go too far astray criticizing Russia.
So pretty incredible. But again, that article is posted there, and I think we've sort of seen that too. As a matter of fact, when we say we want to pull back on pipelines, all of a sudden, did you notice the president actually talking to Russia about their pipelines?
Yes.
So the ironies of some of this are incredible. But Jacki, when we come back, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of affordable energy, because the whole idea of the Green New Deal and climate change and the rest is the idea that we just need to make sure that other countries do not develop their energy. And when you go to some of these countries, and I think you have, and certainly I have, you go to a third world country and you realize their only energy sources are wood or maybe various animal droppings is a nice way to say it. And that's what you are going to lock people into for the rest of their lives. We recognize that affordable energy, as your article points out, really is a way to address the issue of obviously significant inequality. So we've posted that article. Thought you would want to read it. And as you go there, you'll find a couple of the articles by both Jacki Deason and Merrill Matthews. If you would want to go to either of those websites, we have those there. You have a lot of articles at ipi.org. If you type in energy, I did that, and then it goes, so there are quite a few. Jackie's got some as well. And so we've got those. I might just mention my viewpoints commentary today. We'll get into it maybe in the next hour. Has to do with that school board letter and some of the things we learned in terms of the Attorney General. We also, of course, have some other great resources for you. And, of course, I mentioned the Winter Olympics. We have our fact sheet on that as well on the website at pointofview.net. Only took one call, but if you'd like to join again, 1-800-351-1212. We'll take a break, and we will continue our conversation about energy, the environment, and the Green New Deal right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and as I've said before, sometimes you don't think about energy until you don't have it. And, of course, there are a number of people today that have been without it. And a year ago, we talked about Snowmageddon. And even over the summer, for those of you in California and other places, brownouts and blackouts and all the rest. And that's when you begin to realize how important energy is to an economy. And, Jackie, our article that we've posted here, Affordable Energy to Combat Inequality. We have people right now that lament lament the inequality in this country or the inequality between first world countries and third world countries. But the answer is energy, even though oftentimes our liberal friends don't really want to admit that that's really the case.
They have no idea. The 1 billion people without electricity are out of sight and out of mind. And so I don't think we have any more of these television specials, these fundraising marathons for people in Ethiopia who are struggling through famine. Like when I was a little girl, really made an impression on me. Back in those days, in the early 80s, about 50% of the world's population was in extreme poverty. And that means they could not pay for basic food and shelter needs. Today, it's about 10%, even though the population's exploded. One of the greatest stories in human history is the ability to lift billions of people out of gut-wrenching poverty. And how did it happen? The deployment of energy to those places, to run water wells, to run hospitals, to quadruple their crop yields with natural gas fertilizer, things like this. No one tells this story. And this is how we did it. And so now, for those 1 billion people who are still out there, a mother holding a dying child, completely unnecessarily, they need energy. And I'm not talking about wind and solar. I'm talking about the kind that produces all the time, not just a third of the time when conditions are good, to basically feed themselves. And so that is the equality issue of our time. The crisis is now for that 1 billion people. It's not 12 years from now when there's climate change sufficient to have changed some conditions. It's right this second.
I think of Bono, and not somebody I quote very often on this, but saying that the reason we've been able to move so many people out of abject poverty is due to the free market or capitalism. And he said that somewhat begrudgingly, but really capitalism and energy are the two, if you will, great equalizers. And we don't hear enough about it because all we hear is we need to reduce our energy use in the United States. As good as that may be, we really need to bring people out of poverty.
And it allows people to be productive in places they couldn't otherwise. We live here in Texas. It gets really hot here in the summer. Before the air conditioning came around, I sort of wonder, how did people go through some of these summers in Texas? But by having the air conditioning on, you can be productive all day. You can get a good night's sleep and other things, but you can't do that without the energy. Yeah. And so it allows us to be able to create a thriving economy because we can work and get things done just by the energy that we don't really think about because it's always there.
One thing we haven't really mentioned, I thought I'd put it on the table. We've talked about fossil fuels. We've talked about alternative energy, nuclear. And Jacki, I'd like to get your thoughts, and maybe Dr. Merrill Matthews the same, because I've gone to other countries like France, and there isn't a hesitancy about nuclear. There's a willingness to realize that that's part of the energy mix. But if you look at Germany or you look at many of the environmentalists in this country, you would think that was just the worst thing to possibly consider.
So I grew up right next to one of the country's premier energy nuclear plants, and a lot of my family worked there. It was both a commercial grade uranium plant, also weapons grade. So we had everything there. And it was the largest employer, and the biggest issue every congressional election is who's going to bring the jobs back to the nuclear plant. So we are 110% nuclear and pro-nuclear. And so people who understand it, who live near it, are in favor. It's the people who only see the news stories that are negative that are against. As you know, it's emissions free in its generation. And so if that's what you're after, how can you leave it out? I mean, it's probably the answer if you want to be as rapidly environmentalist as possible, and carbon is your linchpin. It really shouldn't be, but if it is, nuclear is your favorite form of energy, probably.
And one of the things that's happening is that they're creating I think they call them small nuclear plants. They're smaller. They're sort of created in modular things and not the great big nuclear reactors that we used to see. So these reactors are smaller. They're able to put them together, put several of them together in one place. And my understanding is those are being moved out, and they're much more affordable. They're safe. They're easier to construct, and you don't have all the time and haven't had the environmental pushback on these. And so if we're able to do that, you may make nuclear a viable, affordable option and a clean option for people. And there's even some of the environmentalists who are willing. They used to be for nuclear. They turned against it completely. And now I think I hear some of them coming back saying, maybe we can do this at least for part of the energy generation.
One of the things I've mentioned before, and we should mention it again, is you can go to ipi.org, and you have from a regular basis now bring in individuals. And one of those you brought in was Michael Schellenberger,
right,
and his book, which I highly recommend, Apocalypse Never: Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All. And
he was an environmentalist. He was engaged in those things.
Matter of fact, he has the new book out, San Francisco. We're going to talk about that in terms of homelessness.
We've got him coming February 25th.
Yeah,
fantastic.
And again, a good book, by the way. I've got a copy, and matter of fact, our next issue of Outlook is on homelessness, and we're going to be quoting from his book. But anyway, here's a man that was in the environmental movement. You got Bjorn Lomborg and a number of others that are saying, if we really are concerned about emissions, and of course we can have all sorts of debates about how important those emissions are, then nuclear would be one of the best. It is very energy productive, and it doesn't produce emissions, but there is this desire, I guess, on the part of the environmentalists to try to just dedicate everything to solar and wind and hope it's going to work out that way.
And that's what they've wanted to try to do, and it just hasn't worked out well.
Yes. So again, I would encourage you to go to ipi.org. And of course, Michael, you can actually watch the previous one, I think, and then San Francisco. That's kind of an interesting one on the whole issue of homelessness. But Jacki, let's talk about also people that can watch the Jacki Daily Show, because you're covering these issues on a regular basis, aren't you?
Yes, every week on The Blaze, which is the outlet where you've seen Glenn Beck and Mark Levin. Basically, you find me there every Sunday morning from 7 to 9 a.m. So it's a 2-hour show, but only people over 50 ask the question, when is the show on? The answer is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on podcast,
yes, right?
You can find it on iHeartRadio, Spotify, iTunes, Spreaker, Stitcher, all of those. And if you're in West Texas, in the oil patch, there are 10 counties there that carry the show on KWEL. That's 107.1 FM. Out in Monahans, Midland, Odessa, Andrews, all those places.
And we do have some stations out there, so they can do that. And just before we go, Dr. Merrill Matthews, next time we have you on, I want to talk about medical ethics and health care. But just this week, the California legislature wanted to try to pass universal health care, single-payer health care. Now, again, if you know California, and I grew up there, my dad ran for the California Assembly, you have basically a veto-proof legislature, and you have a super legislature, but they still, even among the Democrats, could not pass single-payer.
I'm hesitant to say some common sense broke out in California, because they tried to do that about in 2005, and they actually did pass it. They had to rely on Governor Schwarzenegger to veto the bill.
Yes, but again, as people start looking at this, whether it's common sense in energy or common sense in the whole area of healthcare, that's just some things you write about. And so, Jacki, it's been great to have you in studio.
Thank you.
I
Great
hope
to be
you'll come
here.
here again. I learned so much in just that 1 hour that we will get into some of the issues in the news. Dr. Merrill Matthews, again, we have links to the Jacki Daily Show. We have links to IPI, the Institute for Policy Innovation. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to read some of the articles they've posted, they are there. And then use those to then go to other articles that will give you some great information. But we need to take a break. When we come back, we'll get into some of the issues in the news. After all, Joe Rogan's still in the news. We'll talk about that briefly and a few other topics related to that. But you can find all the things we're talking about today on the website, which is pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation this hour, we're going to look at some of the issues in the news, but it's an open line, so I'd love to get your thoughts. And even as I cover some of these different kinds of stories, if you have some others you want to add to the mix, certainly appropriate. I did, when we were ending there, just mention very quickly that if you look at California right now, considering this idea of a single-payer plan or universal health coverage, this is something that has been promoted for years. And again, even where you have kind of a super legislature, you really basically have it controlled by the Democratic Party, still could not get it passed. And Dr. Merrill Matthews will be with us on Friday, so we'll get back into this whole issue of health care and health care delivery and a number of other issues. But I just thought I might just mention that before he headed out the door. And of course, I think we did a great job of educating a lot of us here. Dr. Merrill Matthews and Jacki Deason brought a lot to the table. And if you've always sort of wondered about these issues of energy, the environment, Green New Deal, that is available to you, and it's that first hour. And if you are just now joining us, you might want to go back and listen to it. I learned quite a bit, and I would imagine you did as well. Before we get into some of the topics, let me start with a story that illustrates the kind of continuing frustration that I have, and I'll take it out of news and just bring it into maybe an experience that you've had before. Maybe you've been witnessing to someone, you talk about the fact that you're a Christian, you're maybe sharing the gospel, and they look at you and say, well, I just can't believe the Bible because it's full of errors. Well, of course, I've always trained you that the question you need to ask next is, well, what errors would that be? Can you give me some examples of errors in the Bible? When you ask that question, 7 times out of every 10 times, in my experience, at least almost 3/4 of the time, people can't come up with one, or they come up with one that's so simplistic that you go, really? That's your example of an error? Most of the time I get the, well, I just know there are ones. I can't tell you right now. Okay, fine. But there is a sense in which that reminds me of what's going on right now with the issue of Joe Rogan and some of the comments being made on various news programs. Because I was listening to one just the other day, and they're ranting and raving about the fact that Joe Rogan has had a couple of these doctors on, 2 of them in particular, and they're talking about all the misinformation, and I'm waiting for, can you give me an example? I mean, because there's a reason for that. If there has been very poor or misguided information that's making its way out into the culture, I feel like it's our responsibility to counter it. So instead of saying we want to censor it, critique it for no other reason than if you are convinced that there is misinformation, just to say that that's reason to pull a person off of Spotify. Not going to happen, by the way. That's not enough. You need to say, well, here's why that information is incorrect. And I've had a real difficult time finding examples of what they think is misinformation. So the best place I've found is that there was this open letter by hundreds of doctors who have been calling for Spotify to take Joe Rogan off the air. And I found a few examples in their letter, but very few. And I thought, just as a public service, let me mention what these doctors say is the problem with the Joe Rogan interviews with Dr. Malone and, well, the other name I can't remember at the moment. And first of all, they say Joe Rogan has repeatedly spread misleading and false claims on his podcast, provoking distrust in science and medicine. Okay. If I went through the list, I come up with 4. 2 having to do with Joe Rogan, 2 having to do with Dr. Malone. Okay, here they are. Number 1, he has, that is Joe Rogan, discouraged vaccination in young people and children. Okay, we understand why some of that has been said because we recognize the possibility of an adverse reaction from a young child is pretty rare, and that's why there have been many people simply saying maybe vaccinating young children isn't that important. But that's, error number 1, okay? Here's error number 2, that he's promoted the off-label use of ivermectin to treat COVID-19. Okay, that's a treatment issue. I think it'd be fair to say that even though the scientists or the doctors that signed this feel that that is irresponsible, there are other doctors with pretty good credentials that have shown that it seems to work. But okay, those are the 2 that I can come up with of Joe Rogan. The other 2 that I could come up with were from the interview he did with Dr. Malone, who, by the way, again, is pretty reputable when they keep dismissing him as he's a fringe individual. By the way, wasn't he the one that came up with some of the mRNA research? But again, number 3, Dr. Malone has spread an unfounded theory that societal leaders have hypnotized the public. I remember when that came out. He says, some people have just been kind of caught into this hypnosis. And so, again, that's not necessarily saying that's misinformation. It might have provoked a little distrust of some of the medical authorities, but okay, that's number 3. And then number 4, Dr. Malone has compared pandemic policies to the Holocaust. Well, I would say to Dr. Malone or anybody else, anytime you mention Hitler, Nazis, or the Holocaust, that, is almost evidence that you lose in your argument. So we've said that before. But those are the 4. And that's not the best list. I was thinking there was something else to that. And so one of the things that we have posted for you today is a piece that Megan Basham has put together on 4 times big tech censored COVID misinformation that turned out to be true. Because you remember Joe Rogan was saying the other day, and we quoted from him, and you may now have seen his YouTube video in which he said, look, there are some things that we can say now, but if you said those, I think he said 8 months ago, you'd be deplatformed. So when we come back from the break, I'll go through those. The first one is pretty straightforward, one we've been following for some time. What about the lab leak theory? We now know a lot more about it than we did before. The second one was about the COVID vaccine and the impact that it has on menstrual cycles. Again, one we haven't really mentioned very much on the program. Then the last 2 have to do with the issue of masks and their effectiveness, and then the last one on natural immunity. So I thought we would go through those, but I've also posted them for you to read because it's a reminder that when we got into this 2 years ago, there were some things we didn't know. And quite frankly, we've had individuals that have said that when they first got into this, they were actually spraying things and making sure that they wiped down every counter. There were fears that the virus would live for long periods of time on a counter, which there still seems to be some evidence of that. And we were convinced that masks would be useless. Then we were told masks would be helpful. Now we're coming back to maybe it's not. And so there are some things that we've learned. Also, there was real fear that maybe this would affect young people more than it has. And so we've learned some things, but I think the point I wanted to make is that the comment by Joe Rogan the other day probably had at least a little bit of merit, because some of those things, which if you had said them a few months ago, would have probably caused you to be deplatformed or to be completely removed. We now know a little bit more, and that's okay. Science is a place where we learn more information, more investigation gives us some answers. So I thought we would cover that in the next segment. And then we've posted one, not to forget what's going on in the border right now. Very good piece by Byron York. He is the chief political correspondent for, again, Washington Examiner. And so we'll get into some other issues in the news because, after all, there's a lot more to cover, but we'll come back and talk briefly about so-called COVID misinformation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Back Back in October and November, I did commentaries about the letter that was sent to the White House from the National School Board Association suggesting that protesting parents could be designated as domestic terrorists. It encouraged the administration to use any laws at its disposal, including the Patriot Act originally intended for Muslim terrorists. The school board letter led to Attorney General Merrick Garland's memorandum directing the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office to investigate parents protesting school boards. They were to investigate what was called a disturbing spike in harassment, intimidation, and threats of violence against school administrators, board members, teachers, and staff. At the time, I argued that any true acts of intimidation and violence deserved action from local law enforcement. But most of the examples cited did not involve violence and could hardly justify federal involvement. The National School Board Association apologized for sending the letter and admitted they should have had a better process in place to allow for consultation in communication of this significance. But it turns out that they did consult with President Biden's Education Secretary as internal emails obtained from a Freedom of Information Act request. Although the Education Department spokesman claims that the Secretary didn't solicit a letter from the school board, I think we understand the process. One branch of the federal government consults with a private organization that then sends a letter to the federal government. Then the Attorney General writes a memorandum calling for action against parents. See how it works? By the way, the administration didn't apologize. Instead, the Justice Department then announced that it was forming a new domestic terrorism unit. No wonder so many Americans are becoming so disillusioned with this administration. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. I thought I would give it one segment to talk about this, and I'm going to move on to some other issues in the news because there are quite a few. But this one is entitled, and it came from the Daily Wire, 4 times Big Tech censored COVID misinformation turned out to be true. And since there are 4, I'll kind of divide it up into fourths. And the first one is, of course, one we've talked about before, the lab leak theory. And that is, Megan Basham talks about the fact that early on in the pandemic, we know that Anthony Fauci and the director of NIH, Francis Collins, were actually hearing from various scientists offering evidence that COVID did not begin in the laboratory. We now know that some of the individuals that were part of this, as a matter of fact, the individual leading it, might have had some kind of involvement, so it may have been an attempt to deflect it. And to be fair to them, although I do have some questions about what was happening behind the scenes by Dr. Anthony Fauci and by Dr. Francis Collins, you do have a post that came out just about 2 years ago in which Francis Collins said, you know, some folks are even making the outrageous claim that the pandemic was engineered in a laboratory and deliberately released. Okay. That is further than what many people were alleging. They simply said this may have been a gain of function research, which we now know was taking place, and it could have resulted accidentally. If it was intentional, well, you have to prove that. But, okay, I understand why he was reacting to that. But now you can then follow the implications of the rest. And that's why I think Megan did a good job of pointing out that even a year ago, you had Facebook announced an update to its sweeping misinformation policy intended to remove more false claims about COVID-19 and vaccines. And one of those is that they would ban any claims that COVID leaked from the Wuhan lab. Meanwhile, while that's taking place on Facebook, Google would not allow its search engine to auto-populate lab leak among coronavirus. And again, Google said that's because the company did not want to lead people down pathways that we find would not have authoritative information. And so we realize that even after the president, that would be Joe Biden, ordered the various intelligence agencies to conduct a 90-day investigation, they simply did not come to the conclusion that it came from the Wuhan lab. But you're starting to see more and more people saying, yes, this was something that looks exactly like something that was being engineered in the laboratory. It was gain-of-function research. And as a result, we can have debates forever about whether it was intentional or accidental, but the reality is that's probably where it came from. And the fact is almost all the outbreaks were in Wuhan, which is located right where the Wuhan Institute for Virology is. I think you can draw a logical conclusion. But let's move on to the next one. This one's a little more complicated. COVID, vaccine, and menstrual cycles. One of the issues that surfaced with the vaccine where some wondered whether or not the vaccine might affect fertility. Now, this one, I think you could give partial credit to. The fact is that when we began to see people wondering, even out loud, as to what this might affect to a woman's cycle, Facebook and Twitter actually slapped misinformation labels on any post from women questioning the impact that it might have on them to get pregnant. Now, it turns out that the studies that have come down, and one just came out 2 weeks ago, felt and documented that COVID vaccines could disrupt a woman's menstrual cycle. That doesn't necessarily mean it would prevent pregnancy, but I think you could at least say that what was labeled as misinformation, now we know a little bit more than we did before. And so obviously, if I can get just slightly graphic for a second, I think any of us know anything about human biology that if you disrupt the menstrual cycle, it changes the time of ovulation, it changes the time of fertility. So no, it doesn't necessarily interrupt pregnancy, but it does affect it. And so, I would put that as maybe one half. The last two, pretty simple. And again, these are things we've talked about, but let's go into them in more detail. The first was the issue of masks. Now, we've been through the whole litany of arguments. This time 2 years ago, we were being told not to get masks. They're not effective, on and on and on. But again, what was so interesting here, again, Megan talks about the fact that at that time, Dr. Scott Atlas, who, by the way, was one of President Trump's pandemic advisors, said on his Twitter account that indeed do masks work, and he said no, and then had a series of citations of various research that had been done questioning how effective a cloth mask was. For doing that, Twitter closed down his account only 12 hours, but again, it was an attempt to get kind of a slap on the hands to prevent anything from being said about masks. And of course, now we have a fair amount of evidence that suggests that indeed, as we've heard from other individuals, the best masks are the most effective and the cloth masks are the least effective. And if you go back to listen to some of the conversations we had with Dr. Jay Richards at about this time 2 years ago, because he was the one that came on with an article that appeared in the stream saying, look, when people saying masks don't work, well, we recognize that with masks, you have to think good, better, and best. Okay, the best are going to be the ones that are used by doctors and nurses in the hospital, but anything covering your face might be somewhat helpful. And again, you recognize that the higher quality N95 mask, the KN95 mask, were obviously going to be more effective than some loosely tied woven clothing mask. So again, we recognize that, but again, we see that anybody even suggesting that masks aren't that effective, now we're starting to hear people making those statements all the time. Which brings me to our fourth and our last one. Then we're going to move on to some other topics. Natural immunity and whether or not vaccine immunity. And you can go back to a year ago when you had the Harvard epidemiologist, that would be Martin Kulldorff, who, when asked a question as to whether a person needs to be vaccinated if he or she has already had COVID, he replied no, thinking that everyone must be vaccinated is as scientifically flawed as thinking nobody should. Those with prior natural infection do not need it. Well, of course, you know what happened there. This was seen as very controversial. Twitter closed him down. Now, he was able to keep his account, so it's not like they permanently banned him, but they did permanently ban Dr. Robert Malone. We just mentioned his name just a minute ago because of his so-called repeated violations of COVID-19 misinformation, one of those having to do with the issue of natural immunity. Well, again, you can go to some of the sightings that are here, but we have a study, for example, out of California, New York, that found that natural immunity significantly outperformed vaccines. The quote here, people who had previously been infected with COVID-19 were better protected against the Delta variant than those who were vaccinated alone, suggesting that natural immunity was a more potent shield than vaccines against the variant. That comes from Reuters. I can give you some other examples, but I think you understand that in each one of these cases, there was a real deliberate attempt by social media and sometimes by people in the mainstream media to actually call for individuals to either be shut down, to be deplatformed. In a few cases, it only was, say, 12 hours for Scott Atlas. For, again, a Harvard epidemiologist Martin Kulldorff, it was for a longer period of time. And of course, for Dr. Robert Malone, it's been a permanent ban. So we can see that this is why, as we've said so many times before, read widely. Just because one person says it, even if they've got an MD or a PhD behind their name, go and see if there's some other people making some other statements, because after all, we're still learning when it comes to the issue of COVID. Anyway, those are some pieces that we have posted on the website here. If you go to our website at pointofview.net, you'll scroll down and you will see that we've posted a couple of articles by Jacki Deason and Dr. Merrill Matthews, but the second to the bottom one, COVID misinformation that turned out to be true. And if you'd like to read it, it is actually something you'll find under a paywall, but we've made it a little easier for you to read it so that you can see that at least partially what Joe Rogan said the other day when he was holding up his, iPhone and doing a little short mention that some of these things, if you'd said them 8 months ago, you would have been deplatformed. Now they're kind of accepted. Here's at least 4 examples of where big tech censored what were called misinformation, which are now kind of assumed to be pretty accurate in terms of what is going on with COVID. We come back for the break. Let's get into what's going on the border. It is amazing, and I'm glad that a few people like Byron York are writing about it, and we'll talk about that right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. You know, the sad reality is there are so many different things we can talk about every day here on Point of View that aren't going well, and it's almost a coin flip sometimes to figure out which ones we're going to talk about. But I did think that this piece that I'm going to read from now by Byron York about the border is essential for a couple of reasons. First of all, you would not have imagined this a few years ago. Matter of fact, there's a very good piece by Frank Mile. He actually writes for Real Clear Politics. And some of the people writing for Real Clear Politics are liberal. Sometimes they're conservative. Not exactly sure where he is, but he was making the case about the fact that there's almost like I hate to use the word psychosis because we were just talking about how sometimes these words get thrown around, but he says he's using as an example just thinking about our southern border. He said just even a few years ago, he says it would have been unimaginable that the government would allow and even encourage millions of foreigners to enter our nation without following the rules, without being vetted, and very possibly without good intentions. But he says powerful organizations, corporations, politicians have turned illegal immigration into an art form. And he says, we're just supposed to just nod and go along. Not so long ago, I can play, if you wanted to, clips that come from even Senator Bernie Sanders, individual that from a philosophical and political point of view would disagree with most of the conversations we have around this table, who nevertheless lamented the issue of illegal immigration. I can point to State of the Union addresses by Governor Bill Clinton, former Governor Bill Clinton, President Bill Clinton, as well as, of course, President George W. Bush, but even President Barack Obama are lamenting illegal immigration. And now we're just supposed to just kind of nod and act as if there's nothing going on. And so it is, I think, striking that even people who wouldn't necessarily agree with some of the things we talk about around this table at Point of View have now just been sort of scared into silence, I guess, or convinced that this is really the best way to support one political party or the nation or whatever, and it's a sad commentary. So with that as background, let me get to this piece, and it's the last article we've posted on the website at pointofview.net, and it's by Byron York. With, of course, the Washington Examiner, chief political correspondent. And the title of it is The Border Gets Worse and Worse. Because he says these days the Biden White House talks a lot about the border. At press briefings, we get many questions about the border, but it is the Russian-Ukraine border. Meanwhile, the situation at the U.S.-Mexico border is deteriorating daily. He first of all talks about two new developments. One, we are learning more about the administration's covert attempts to relocate thousands of illegal border crossers, single adult males, not families, into the nation's interior. Talked about that the other day on our Friday weekend edition, but it's worth mentioning again. And he says, we'll talk about that today and tomorrow and the next development, new information about the changing makeup of the thousands of people crossing the border illegally each month. He says, first, the relocation effort. Last week, Fox News broadcast body cam footage from security officers at New York's Westchester County Airport, which is about 30 miles outside of Manhattan, if you're not familiar where that is. It was in the middle of the night. An unmarked passenger jet had just landed, and a steady stream of single adult men came down the plane steps. They were accompanied by federal contractors. Alarmed, one of the security officers approached one of the federal contractors. You're on a secure facility here, and we don't really know anything, and we're in charge of security. He says, so hence we're having a problem here. Now, you think about this. If you were to land a plane and disembark from maybe at a terminal of a normal airport, and this airplane came from someplace and you weren't sure where it was, even if you had been assured that these individuals had been cleared by TSA, you'd want to clear them again, wouldn't you? And so that's kind of what's going on here. And so he's talking about the fact that there's a problem. Well, then the contractor said, a lot of this is just down low stuff. We really don't tell the people. So, of course, you get the fact that this is done under some kind of attempt to prevent anybody from knowing about it. Of course, the camera's rolling at that time, so we now know about it. And he goes on to say, because we don't want to do this and we don't want to attract attention, we don't want the media, like we don't even know where they're going when they tell us. So think about this. We've seen them get into one airplane in the Harlingen Airport, which is, again, if you're not familiar with geography, near the border of Mexico in Texas, and they fly off. Now, whether they flew from Harlingen or somewhere else, they then land. They're not checked before they get on the airplane. They're not checked when they come off the airplane. And imagine trying to do this at any major airport in the country, where we don't know who you are, and we don't know where you're going, and we don't know if you have something in your bag that might be dangerous. We don't know if you actually are COVID-19 positive, and you can go through the long list that you would have to actually hit every one of those check marks before you would actually be able to fly somebody from one part of the country to another. So again, this is, what they call down low stuff. So, Byron York continues. Then he says, I get the whole secrecy thing, but even this is above my pay grade. What's the big secret? Everybody knows what's happening. Of course, we know what's happening. It's coming from the administration. And so, again, as we've pointed out, if you actually have a test and you're COVID-19 positive, just think about your likelihood of being able to get on a plane. If we don't even know where you came from and you're going to get on a plane, what are the chances you would get on any kind of airliner? And so you can begin to see the problem that is surfacing even with this video. But then Byron York goes on. No, not everyone knows it's happening. Earlier in Texas, Fox News' Bill McGullen witnessed bus after bus of illegal border crossers being readied for flights further into the United States. He reported that adult migrants have their chains and cuffs removed as they're released from ICE custody in Brownsville today. The men were then escorted into a parking garage where a black tarp was set up to obscure and obstruct public view, and they were discreetly taken away by a non-governmental organization, an unofficial travel coordination agency. And it says, again, you'd be shocked to learn that the Biden White House does not want to talk about this. Last week, Fox News' Peter Doocy asked the White House spokeswoman, Jen Psaki, why is it that large numbers of single adult men are being released into the United States just hours after being apprehended at the southern border? Well, of course, you know the response. Jen Psaki feigned ignorance. I'm not sure the specifics, she said, of what you're referring to, and then explained that one way the administration deals with single adults who cross the border illegally is an alternative to detention program in the interior of the United States. Sometimes that means moving migrants to one part of the United States to move to a different detention facilities when they wait for the next steps in the immigration process, such as court hearings, and are required to check in with a local ICE office. Doocy noted that they do not show up for those check-ins. Of course, we know that to be the case. Psaki said that no shows will be subject to the repercussions of all of that. And that, by the way, was the end of the press conference, essentially. So what we're finding now is that more and more of these individuals are being put on planes, going to the interior of the United States. And as a result, even if they are caught, those are listed as misdemeanors. And as a result, those misdemeanors include, are you ready for this list? Assault, DUI, drug possession, and illegal reentry. And so you can begin to see what is being done really under the cloud of night in a sense, almost a legal trafficking of individuals into this country. And again, Byron York reminds us that the public knows very little about this process. How many illegal immigrants have been located? Where have they been sent? How many have been charged or convicted of crimes? How many have complied with the requirement to check in with immigration authorities? What non-governmental organizations are assisting them? How much is the federal government paying for this? Is there a limit to how many will be relocated? Those are all good questions. Do we have an answer to every one of those? Do we have an answer to any one of those?
I think you know the answer. So again, if you would like to have, I think, one of the better documentations, this is really just 2 pages, easy to read, Byron York. And again, it reminds us of what's going on in the southern border. And we will continue talking about it, if for no other reason than the mainstream media is not talking about it. And when questions are raised in the press conference, those are almost never answered with any kind of definitive answer. And I think the American people deserve to know that. Well, that's our last article on the website. I'll take some phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. We'll get into a couple of other issues right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention that tomorrow we are going to be, and that's Groundhog Day, but I don't know if you've noticed, but Puxatawny, Pennsylvania has canceled Groundhog Day because the groundhog died. Don't know if you knew that, but anyway, we will have Groundhog Day tomorrow, and Percy McCrae will be with us. Interesting ministry to cancer patients, so we'll talk about that just real briefly. And then Ryan Baumberger, supposed to be on with us yesterday, never did find out what happened, but hopefully we'll have him on tomorrow, and then we'll get back into some of the issues in the news. So lots to cover in that regard, and so again, those are all very important issues. And just before we move on to another topic, one of the callers off air couldn't stay on, but wanted to know, why is it that the president wants to bring all these people in illegally? And they always, in the administration, act as if, well, this is happening, we don't have any control. But once you sort of open the gates, you decide to stop building the wall, you actually just begin to
to move more people into the interior. The theory has been, and again, I'm just guessing, but I think it's a reasonable guess, that these are potential new voters in the future. That individuals coming to this country benefiting from this are more likely to vote Democratic, and so as a result, we are not going to prevent them from coming in. Matter of fact, we're going to encourage them to come in, and the way to prove that is if all of a sudden you were to be able to identify that lots of people coming to this country would vote for the Republican Party, there would be an attempt to prevent them, and a good illustration of that is when the Secretary of Homeland Security a while back spoke out about the number of Cubans coming to this country. Cubans that come from Cuba, in particular, tend to vote more Republican, and he was seemingly much more concerned about Cubans who would arrive on our shores than individuals from Mexico or various Latin American countries arriving on our shores. So that might be one explanation. There may be some others, but that seems to be at least a possibility and an illustration why all of a sudden we've gone from a time in which you've had Democratic presidents like Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, presidential candidates and senators like Bernie Sanders, who used to speak out against illegal immigration, now not saying anything about it, and some in cases actually encouraging it. I might take another phone call in just a minute, but let me just mention that our Viewpoints commentary today has the title School Board Letter, and it is something that we've mentioned before, but you might remember this letter that was actually sent to the administration, and that's what led the Attorney General Merrick Garland to issue a memorandum directing the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's offices to investigate parents protesting school boards. And I think you can see a natural connection between what we just talked about and this letter. You would think that the Attorney General, working with the Secretary of Homeland Security, would be really concerned about people crossing the border and about the fact that those people crossing the border are not being vetted and thus could be individuals that have a very long and lengthy criminal rap sheet and those kinds of things. But those are some very significant issues. But anyway, my commentary today reminds us that even though the National School Board actually apologized for sending the letter, it was one of those interesting kind of situations where we now discover that actually the education department actually encouraged the National School Board Association to express their opinions. Now, to be fair, a spokesman for the Education Department claims that the Secretary didn't solicit the letter from the school board, but I think we understand the particular way the game is played. And that is that on the one hand, you actually encourage the National School Board to send a letter. Maybe didn't solicit the letter. Okay, I'm trying to be fair. But then that letter is used by the administration then to justify a memorandum to the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office to investigate parents. And so it's an interesting play of games, and it's just one more example of where once the facts come out, we realize the way in which some of the games are being played behind the scenes. Let's take some more phone calls, though. Let's go to Georgia. Mike, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
On the border issue, it seems that when the former president was in office and he tried to take a stand on maybe the border and other issues, when he would maybe issue some executive order or something, lawsuits would be filed almost immediately and his action would be stayed. I'm wondering why, if what's going on now with flights into the interior and so on, people not being vetted at the border, why doesn't some conservative group or somebody file a suit to stop this or mandamus the president to do his job or Homeland Security to do their job?
Sounds good to me, and maybe we need to get somebody on to talk about that, because I do know of some groups that certainly believe in secure borders, and I'm unaware of those lawsuits. let me investigate and see whether or not there's something making its way through a circuit court of appeals or something like that. But it has been, I think, always amazing to me that when President Trump would issue some kind of order, whether it was the issue of whether we're going to allow people to come to this country from countries where there was a great deal of terrorism of the right, you would have one federal judge, and it sometimes was in the state of Washington, one case it was in the state of Hawaii, could actually put on hold the entire nation. And I've always felt that that was unfair, even though sometimes it's been used the other way against Barack Obama and more recently against Joe Biden. Why should one federal judge be able to stop that? But given the fact that that's been used by the liberals to stop various actions by Donald Trump, why couldn't a conservative group use it to stop some of the things being done right now under the Biden administration? So I think you are asking a very good question. Let me see if we can research it and maybe get somebody on that actually has filed one of those lawsuits and find out what has happened, because it's a good question. If we are really concerned about the border, then we should do something about it. And it seems to me that part of the problem is that I would say most Americans aren't actually calling for action right now because most Americans are unaware of what has been taking place. That video, let's give credit where credit was due, the body cam footage from Fox News and some of the other stories that have been reported that came from Fox News would certainly give us a view of what has been taking place for some time. It's one thing to report it happening. It's another thing to see those videos. And we talked about it last Friday. Maybe we can talk about it again on Friday. I'll see what we can find out with Dr. Merrill Matthews and Penna Dexter and cover some of that as well. So very good question. And as I've said before, we sometimes have as many reporters as we have listeners to point of view. So if you see something or hear something or find an article that would be helpful, send it on to us because we would greatly appreciate it. Let me mention again that this particular piece on the school board letter once again shows the way the game is played, and sometimes we need to be just sophisticated enough to understand that is the case. My commentary tomorrow then continues on with this idea of beginning to list, for example, parents as possible domestic terrorists, when we do have real domestic enemies sometimes. And so we, in this column today and the column tomorrow, really kind of take on some of those issues. So you can find all of those on our website at pointofview.net. Let me just real quickly mention that if you haven't had a chance to listen to the first hour roundtable, we had Jacki Deason and Merrill Matthews. We've posted an article by her, two of the articles by Dr. Matthews. And if you wanted to know a little bit more about this issue of energy and the environment, certainly a very relevant topic, especially right now when 1 million people don't have power in the Northeast, and many others might be out of power with some of these storms flying through the country. That's a good reason to go and find some of those articles. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow on our Wednesday Point of View. We'll see you then.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.